to it fast. Right here on the Anycast. Make it strong, make it last. Right here on the Anycast.
Okay, I am here today with... There's been so many people this season where I'm like a podcasting legend, but this time I actually still mean it the same way I meant it the last 7 times. Podcasting legend, Rob Greenlee. How are you, Rob?
Doing great. It's great to be here, Matt. It's great to do your show. Yeah, I've been watching some of the past episodes, and they've been terrific. So
you have way too much free time on your hands, or you're lying. Either way, I appreciate it. So before we dig in, if anybody's unfamiliar with who you are, where you came from, give us 2 minutes. Who's Rob? How'd we get here?
Well, I started on the radio back in 1999, just to kind of take everybody through really quickly here, and did a nationally syndicated radio show up on the XM Satellite Radio Network and on about 15 broadcast stations, and did a lot of early work around streaming my content. And then eventually my show became a podcast back in September of 2004. So since the topic of the show that I was doing was about the growth and development of the World Wide Web and the internet, the show was called Web Talk Radio. And so really kind of took that experience that I had of building that show and started working for platform companies. In 2005, I got my first full-time job working for a podcast kind of platform distribution to mobile phones as far back as 2005. So I've been working in that and worked for Microsoft and Spreaker and Libsyn and Podbean and a bunch of Podcast One out of Los Angeles. I was the chief technology officer down for Podcast One in the early days back in 2014. And I've been a podcaster that whole time too, doing podcasts for the platforms that I worked for. And in 2017 got inducted into the Podcast Hall of Fame, which I'm now kind of leading that. So there's a new Podcast Hall of Fame coming up here in January at the Podfest Expo down in Orlando. So I'm excited for that. But really, at the end of the day, I'm a content creator, but also have extensive background working in software and working for a company like Microsoft, and really built podcasting on the Microsoft platform back when they actually had podcasting. But they got out of that back in about 2014. That's when they dropped podcasting.
If only they were called Zunecasts, we'd still have them.
Back then, they were. What's funny about it is that some things have come full circle, because back then I was really heavily involved in video podcasts. When I was working at Microsoft, that Zune portable media player had a large screen on it. Actually, sometimes they were larger than the iPod screen. So we had a real strong emphasis on the video podcasting stuff, which is kind of a full circle thing for me, because now we're coming back more into video as a linkage to podcasting.
Sure. I mean, and I think a lot of things probably are either full circle or halfway through their cycle.
Yeah, so it was a good idea back then, but maybe not now, has been my theme for many years.
Yeah.
And then maybe what was a good idea back then, maybe the time has come now. So
that's almost like mine. My business one, I frequently find myself saying is, it works so well we stopped doing it.
Yeah, right.
Which is even worse. Yes. I'd be remiss if I didn't try and put a gun to your head here then. So, Rob, what is podcasting?
I think podcasting, from a listener, see, there's 2 ends of the spectrum. There's from a listener perspective, and then there's from a viewer perspective, listener, viewer, consumer perspective, and then there's the industry perspective. And oftentimes when I talk about this, I'm talking about the listener side, but the creator side or the industry side or the distribution side thinks that I'm talking about them. And that's been where the conflict is happening, is that they don't have to think of it the same way I do. I'm thinking of it the way the consumer side is looking at this. And when a viewer or a listener looks at a piece of content from this content creator that happens to be in a video form but looks and sounds like a podcast, guess what? They're going to think it's a podcast. And I think in the big picture, and increasingly other people in the industry are moving this direction too, is that the industry shouldn't care But the only reason they care is because the technology infrastructure was built primarily for audio. And that's what they have, made their investments in. So as we look to the future, I think what we have to do is open our minds to think, and maybe think more about what the audience is thinking about. And I think that is another paradigm shift that's important as we look at commercial radio, because commercial radio, and my experience with it, has primarily always thought about their advertisers first and their audience second. Where podcasting, we should be thinking about audience first and then the commercial side, which is an exact opposite of what mainstream media has typically done. So that's kind of how I'm seeing it, is that we need to include pretty much all digital content now under the definition of as a podcast now.
It's just, a podcast is something I want to watch or listen to. Is that like
exactly? I mean, it can be. I mean, and for years, a podcast could include a PDF too. Back in the early days, the RSS spec included any kind of a digital file attachment to that attachment code in that RSS. And early podcasters used to deliver a PDF file with an MP3 file or a PDF with a video file. In the RSS, Apple used to support it. So all I'm saying is that I think we have to open our minds to what a podcast is and accept the fact that we've moved into a new era where there's a lot of different types of content: short, long, video, audio, music, books, other forms of short form content, paid subscription, that now can be called a podcast. I think it's okay. And I think that's good for the consumption side.
And what's the trap that people can, on the creator side, fall into if they don't want to widen and don't want to broaden that definition?
Yeah, I don't know that it's a trap. I think at the end of the day, this is all about choice, and thinking about this, I think it's valid to come at from a audio first perspective. There are certain genres of content that don't lend themselves to video, right? And there's other types of content that lend themselves more to video than to audio. So you got the full spectrum. So I'm not saying that every podcaster needs to do everything. But I do think that there's some use cases and some genres that would benefit from doing video and audio at the same time with the same content. Maybe making some derivative content from that, just like what you're doing with this program. And so this is an example of where we are today. This isn't a projection of what it's going to look like 2 or 3 years from now. This is a projection of how the digital ecosystem works today. And if you want to fit into that and reach the most audience in the way that audience wants to be reached, and that's the key, is that the audience wants to be able to find your show in audio and in video based on their consumption situation. I think what we're going to see changes is going to be around what kind of content's consumed, what form is it going to be consumed in. But at the end of the day, if we're doing this for humans, it's going to be a human dynamic, right? It's going to be content that's compelling, entertaining, educational, all that stuff will rule the day, and that's not going to change.
Awesome. Well, let's leave it there. Podcast for humans. Let's try and make some.
Yeah.
Rob,
let's do it.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it.
All right. Cheers.
Another round, so much more to talk about. Gonna aim to satisfy with help from CacheFly. Get to it fast. Right here on the Anycast. Make it strong, make it last. Right here on the Anycast. The Anycast podcast, brought to you by CacheFly.